Maren Cole walked into the divorce courtroom with her newborn daughter pressed against her chest, the surgical stitches still burning beneath her thin coat. Every step sent a dull ache across her abdomen. But she would not let herself slow down. After all those years bowed over other people's floors, Maren Cole walked into the divorce courtroom with her newborn daughter pressed against her chest, the surgical stitches still burning beneath her thin coat. Every step sent a dull ache across her abdomen. But she would not let herself slow down. After all those years bowed over other people's floors, she had learned one thing. Once people decide to look down on you, even the way you walk becomes something they put on trial. Across the room, the man who had once vowed to protect her leaned back in his chair, relaxed, as if waiting for a late dinner. Beside him sat another woman in white silk, red nails, her gaze sliding over Maren the way one glances at a smudge of dust on the floor. He did not stand. He did not ask a single question about the baby. He only glanced at the tiny form wrapped in a worn gray blanket, the corner of his mouth curling into something cold, and said loud enough for the front row to hear every word, "I have nothing to do with that child." The whole room seemed to hold its breath. The clerk's hands froze above the keyboard. A reporter looked up from her notebook, her pen suspended in midair. Maren drew her daughter closer. The baby stirred, made a sound softer than a cry, then nestled into the warmth of her mother's collar, and slept on strangely at peace in a room that had just disowned her. The child was only 6 days old. 6 days old, and already denied by the very man whose name sat on her birth certificate. Maren was 28. Dark brown hair knotted low at her neck, a few loose strands falling across cheeks gone hollow from sleepless nights. Her hazel eyes had once known how to shine with hope, had once softened every time that man walked into a room. Today, only stillness remained. A stillness so complete it unsettled people more than any weeping could. He thought she had come here to beg. He thought exhaustion would make her sign the paper. He thought the baby in her arms would make her look pitiful in front of everyone. He was wrong, because at the back of the room, where the light did not reach, a man sat alone and silent. A dark coat, a straight back, his hands folded over one knee. No one in that room knew who he was, and yet no one dared look at him for more than a second. He did not look at the husband. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at the woman in white. He looked only at Maren. And across that stone-cold face, something stirred. Something that, had the people in the front row noticed it, would have made them shiver. They were about to understand what the husband had forgotten. The one who stays silent longest in the room is usually the one who holds the most. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so you can walk with Maren all the way to the end of her journey. The courtroom doors opened, and Judge Eleanor Brandt entered, her silver hair cut short and neat, her black robe falling down her back like a dark stream of water. The entire room rose to its feet in respectful silence. She took her seat, settled her glasses on the bridge of her nose, and brought her wooden gavel down with a dry, hollow crack to call the session to order. She then swept her eyes across the room. Her gaze paused for half a second on the baby sleeping against Maren's chest, and something very faint passed over that stern face, something only women who had once been mothers could read. Then she spoke, her voice low and clear, signaling for everyone to sit. Maren lowered herself into the chair very slowly, her jaw clenched as she swallowed the pain cutting across the part of her abdomen that had only just begun to heal. Judge Brandt opened the file in front of her, turned a few pages, then lifted her eyes toward Preston's table. Her gaze stopped on the woman in the white silk dress sitting close beside the row reserved for counsel, one hand still resting loosely on his sleeve. When the judge spoke, her voice was calm, but sharp as a thin blade. She asked who the woman was, and why she was sitting in a place reserved for clients and attorneys. Preston's lead attorney, a salt-and-pepper-haired man with slicked-back hair named Gerald Pine, quickly stood and cleared his throat. He explained that Miss Sloane Whitaker was present as a media advisor for his client, considering the press attention surrounding the matter. Judge Brandt removed her glasses, folded them, and set them on the bench. She said this was a family courtroom, not a press conference, and that if Miss Pet of Conference, Whitaker was not a lawful party to the case, then she needed to move down to the gallery. A flash of red crossed Sloane's cheeks. She stood, trying to preserve an air of ease, but every step she took toward the back of the room carried the eyes of dozens of people with it, and that ease grew thinner and thinner with each passing moment. Preston did not turn his head to look after her. He only adjusted his cuff slightly, his face still holding the same carefully painted composure as a portrait hanging in a sitting room. Maren looked at him, and for the first time in many months, she no longer felt the old familiar pain rising inside her. There was only a strange calm left behind, the calm of someone who had gone all the way to the bottom and discovered that beneath the abyss was not death, but solid ground on which to stand again. Beside her, Attorney Imogen Frost leaned in and whispered that Marin didn't need to speak right now, that she should simply let everything unfold in order. Imogen was a small woman, with brown hair cut to her shoulders and sharp eyes behind thin framed glasses. She wore an old but neatly pressed gray suit, and for the past 2 days, she had stayed awake almost the entire night, arranging the stack of records now tucked neatly inside the leather case at her feet. Marin gave a small nod. She hadn't come here to argue in the hallway. She hadn't come here to beg for mercy from a man who had never known mercy. She had come here for another reason, a reason neither Preston nor his expensive team of lawyers had even begun to suspect. Judge Brandt turned toward Imogen and asked whether her client was present with the child. Imogen stood and confirmed that Miss Cole had been discharged from the hospital just 1 day earlier, and that she was present today because the opposing side had refused the request to postpone the hearing on medical grounds. The judge's eyes sharpened. She looked toward Preston's table again, longer than before. Marin felt it, very faintly, a fragile thread of something like justice being pulled taut across the room, and then she realized the chair at the back of the courtroom was empty. The man in the dark coat had left at some point, as silently as he had arrived, without a sound, without a word. Only the wooden chair remained, and an unanswered question hanging suspended in the air. Marin lowered her eyes to her daughter sleeping peacefully against her chest. And in that moment, she had no idea that the man who had just left was already on his way to do something that would change everything. To understand how a woman could sit in the middle of a courtroom with an incision that had not yet healed and still hold such silence inside her, one would have to go back 4 years, to the day Marin Cole first walked through the black iron gates of the Calloway estate. She was 24 then, carrying a small suitcase with a few sets of clothes inside and nothing else in the world. Her parents had been gone for a long time, her mother leaving when she was still a child, her father disappearing one winter she had long since stopped counting. She grew up in shelters, passed from one foster home to another, learning how to make herself small, learning how not to trouble anyone, learning how to be grateful even for scraps of leftover bread. Poverty teaches a person many things, but what it taught Marin most thoroughly was how to keep her back straight, even while bowing her head. The Calloway estate was a massive gray stone mansion set on a hill outside Chicago, with long, endless corridors and rooms where even the light seemed to need permission before entering. Marin worked there as a maid, one of the quietest servants in the house, rising before dawn to scrub marble floors so wide they seemed to have no end, polish silver pieces that perhaps no one ever used, and replace fresh flowers in vases their owners rarely bothered to glance at. She was paid to become invisible, and for a long time, she did exactly that, drifting silently through the rooms like a shadow that knew how to breathe. But invisible didn't mean soulless. In that cold, gleaming world, Marin still kept something no amount of money could buy, and no measure of contempt could take away, and that was kindness. She was the only person in the house who remembered that the old gardener's joints hurt whenever the weather turned cold, so she would quietly brew a pot of hot ginger tea and leave it in the corner of the shed. She was the only one who noticed that the new kitchen boy was scolded so often his hands shook, so she often took on the heaviest parts of his work without telling anyone. She treated the gatekeeper, the cook, and the people, this entire house regarded as objects, with a calm tenderness, as though a person's dignity had nothing to do with which step of life's staircase they happened to stand on. She didn't do those things to be seen. She did them because, to her, it was simply the only way to live without losing herself. The other servants in the house cherished her the way people cherish something rare and fragile. They called her the girl with healing hands, because whenever one of them was sick or heartbroken, Marin was always the first to appear, not with hollow words of comfort, but with a bowl of hot soup, a warm cloth, and a silence full of understanding. She understood the loneliness of people who lived at the edges of other people's lives, because she was one of them too, and perhaps because she had grown so used to giving without expecting anything in return, Marin never imagined that there was a pair of eyes, from the upper floors of the mansion, that had been quietly watching her for a very long time. She didn't know that the true master of that house, the man whose name the entire city spoke in cautious whispers, had more than once stopped at the top of the staircase simply to watch a maid bending down to bandage the kitchen boy's hand. or gently helping the old gardener across a slick threshold. In a world where he had grown far too accustomed to deceit, flattery, and fear, Marin's selfless kindness appeared before him like a strange light he couldn't explain. 2 years passed like that, quietly and steadily. Marin had no idea that the seeds of kindness she had sown in silence were waiting for a day, a very distant day, when they would sprout and return to shelter her at the very moment she needed them most. The man who owned those eyes was named Royce Calloway, and in Chicago, there were names people only dared to speak once they were certain no one was listening. On paper, Royce was the chairman of a transportation and real estate conglomerate spread across the Midwest, a 34-year-old businessman, with long convoys of trucks, stretching along the highways and buildings, bearing his name printed on the city map. But behind that polished surface, everyone quietly understood that Royce's true empire operated in the dark, in places where the light of the law did not reach, where every debt was paid, and every promise was kept, one way or another. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his black hair always neatly cut, and a faint scar ran along his jawline like the mark of a past no one dared to ask about. But what made people most wary of Royce was not the scar. It was his cold gray eyes that seemed to look straight through a person and measure them within seconds, without haste, without feeling, like a hunter long accustomed to waiting. Royce had principles, and the men who worked under him knew them by heart. He could be ruthlessly unforgiving toward traitors, toward cheats, toward those who sat high above others and trampled the people beneath their feet. But there was one thing Royce absolutely never tolerated, and that was the strong preying on the weak. In the underworld he ruled. People told one another that the quickest way to invite Royce Calloway's wrath was not to betray him, but to torment someone who had no means of defending themselves. One autumn evening, that truth was proven right there in the mansion's great hall. A man named Dwight Mercer, the head of a loan sharking operation Royce was considering doing business with, came to the house to discuss matters. While he was waiting, he saw the kitchen boy clumsily drop a tray, and at once he seized the boy by the collar, his voice hissing with contempt as he threatened to make him pay for his carelessness. The boy went pale, trembling all over, and then the entire hall suddenly fell deathly silent, because Royce had appeared at the top of the staircase, standing there quietly and looking down without saying a word. Dwight let go of the boy and tried to offer a polite smile, beginning to explain himself. Royce descended the stairs one step at a time, slowly, and with every footfall, he seemed to draw all the air out of the room. He stopped in front of the larger man, and in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, he said that in this house, any man who put his hands on someone weaker than himself would have to ask whether that hand still had any use left afterward. There was no loud threat, no rough gesture, and yet Dwight's face turned ashen. He stammered an apology, excused himself, and that business deal ended that very night. The kitchen boy was safe, and from that day on, no one in the mansion ever dared raise their voice at someone beneath them again. It was in moments like those that Royce began to notice the quiet maid named Marin. He realized that the person who always appeared first to bandage, to comfort, to protect the lowly and voiceless in this house was not him, but her. He did it with power and fear. She did it with something he had lost a very long time ago, something gentle that needed no strength at all. And for the first time in many years, the man the entire city feared found himself curious about another human being, not to weigh whether they were useful or dangerous, but simply to understand why, in a world so cold, someone would still choose to be kind. Preston Ashford came into Marin's life during one winter, and like many other disasters in her life, at first he did not look like a disaster at all. He was the son of one of Royce's business partners, heir to the illustrious Ashford family, with a pharmaceutical corporation spread across the East Coast. But at the time he began visiting the Calloway estate, Preston was a man fallen from favor within his own family. His father, a harsh and ambitious pharmaceutical magnate, had publicly declared that his only son was a disappointment, a pleasure-seeking man with no discipline, unworthy of the Ashford name. His inheritance was left hanging in the balance, his accounts were tightened, and Preston was pushed to the margins like an ornament that had gone out of fashion. He came to Royce to discuss a few private investments, carrying inside him all the bitterness and rebellion of a man who had just been rejected by his own blood. It was during those visits that he noticed Marin. The first time he truly looked at her was when she was kneeling to wipe up the coffee he had accidentally spilled, and instead of growing frantic with fear like the other servants, she simply lifted her eyes to him with a calm hazel gaze and said it was all right. Everyone was clumsy sometimes. In the world where Preston had grown up, no one had ever spoken a gentle sentence to him without calculating something behind it. His father looked at him as though he were a flawed contract. The women who surrounded him looked at him as though he were a check. But this maid, a woman who had nothing to gain and nothing to lose from him, treated him as though he were a human being. He began finding excuses to stay longer, began looking for ways to speak with her in empty corridors. And Marin, so accustomed to being treated as invisible, for the first time felt that someone was truly willing to listen to her. Or at least, she believed that was what it was. Marin didn't know that most of Preston's infatuation did not come from love, but from rebellion. Marrying an orphaned maid with no fortune and no family standing was the perfect revenge against the father who had humiliated him. It was a way of shouting in the face of the entire Ashford family that he didn't need them, that he could decide his own life. But beneath that rebellion, there was also a very small part of Preston that was sincerely conquered, drawn to a warmth his entire velvet-lined life had never touched. And perhaps it was that mixture of calculation and fragile feeling that made his proposal sound so sincere that Marin believed it. She believed that in the middle of a cold world, at last there was someone who chose her, saw her, and wanted to be beside her. They married quietly, with no magnificent church, no lavish wedding celebration, only a simple registration at a small city hall with 2 strangers serving as witnesses. Preston wanted to keep it secret, and he explained to her that it was because he needed time to prepare his family, that he wanted to protect her from the harshness of the Ashford bloodline until everything was settled. Marin believed him, because she had never known a lie so refined. She entered that marriage with all the simple hope of someone who had waited too long to be loved, never realizing that she had just stepped into a house built on sand, and that the day Preston's father changed his mind and called his ruined son home to inherit the family legacy would also be the day her sentence was quietly handed down. Meanwhile, from the upper floors of the mansion, Royce Calloway silently watched his kind-hearted maid leave with a man whom, through the instincts of someone who had lived through too much, he knew very well was not worthy of her. Happiness, if it could even be called happiness, lasted only a little more than 1 year. In the spring of the following year, when Marin was 7 months pregnant with his child, Preston's father suddenly changed his mind. The aging pharmaceutical tycoon realized that he had no other heir, that the empire he had spent his whole life building needed an Ashford name to carry it forward, and so he summoned his ruined son back, holding before him all the power, wealth, and status Preston had once longed for. But the price was stated clearly and coldly. Preston had to cut all ties with that shameful marriage. He had to erase every trace of an orphaned maid from his life, because the Ashford family could not allow its name to be entangled with an ordinary woman of no lineage. And Preston, who had never truly loved Marin more than he loved his own ambition, did not hesitate. One morning, he found her in the kitchen of the small house they rented together, where Marin was standing and slicing a few pieces of apple, because the nausea of pregnancy made it impossible for her to keep down anything else. He did not circle around the matter. He did not prepare her. He simply set his phone on the table and said that this marriage had reached its end, that the 2 of them should bring everything to a peaceful close. His voice was flat, calm in a way that chilled the blood, as though he were announcing the cancellation of a lunch appointment and not the erasure of a family. The knife in Marin's hand froze halfway through its motion. She looked up at him, and for a moment, she thought she must have heard him wrong. She asked what he was saying, her voice trembling not with anger, but with confusion. Preston shrugged, his eyes not even bothering to linger on her face. He said they came from 2 different worlds, that continuing would only make them both suffer, that he had thought it through carefully, and this was his final decision. Marin placed one hand over her belly by instinct, where the baby had just given a small kick, and she asked him about the child. That was the moment Preston's face changed faintly, not out of guilt, but because some cold calculation had just flashed through his mind. He looked at her pregnant belly with the eyes of a stranger, then said in a weightless voice that perhaps they should clarify a few things first, that he wasn't sure whether that child was truly connected to him, that recently he had heard a few rumors. Marin went completely still. She knew that throughout this marriage, she had never looked at another man, and she knew he understood that just as clearly. That doubt was not truth. It was an escape door he had just built for himself, an excuse to deny responsibility, so the Ashford family would not have to concern itself with a grandchild who carried half the blood of a servant. She looked at the man before her, the man she had once believed was the savior of her life, and she realized that she had never truly known him at all. She asked him, her voice no longer trembling but strangely quiet, whether he knew what he had just said about his own child. Preston picked up his phone, glanced at the screen as though this conversation had already taken too much of his time, then replied that he would be very generous, that his lawyer would reach out, that she did not need to turn everything into a tragedy. Those two words, very generous, echoed through the small kitchen like mockery, because Marin understood that in the dictionary of a man like him, generous never meant kind. It only meant that he had finished calculating every move and every path ahead. And standing there, amid the scent of apples and the pale morning sunlight, that woman who was 7 months pregnant felt for the first time the true coldness of the world she had just been pushed into, a coldness that did not come from the weather, but from the heart of the person who should have loved her most. After that fateful morning, everything collapsed faster than Marin could have imagined. The Ashford family did not merely want Preston to leave her. They wanted to erase her from his life, the way one erases a line written by mistake. His lawyer appeared only a few days later, cold and efficient, informing her that the house she was living in belonged to the Ashford family, that all financial support would end from that moment on, and that the health insurance tied to Preston's name had already been cancelled. They did all of that to a woman who was nearly full term in her pregnancy, and they did it methodically, flawlessly, as though there had always been a procedure prepared for removing people who no longer had value. Marin moved out of the house with only the small suitcase from years before, the very same thing she had carried with her when she first walked into the Calloway estate, as if the whole stretch of life that had just passed had been nothing more than a brief dream from which she had been brutally awakened. She rented a shabby room on the edge of the city, and during the final weeks of her pregnancy, she lived on the little money she had managed to save, counting every coin, not daring to call anyone, because she no longer had anyone to call. Then that day came, earlier than expected and more violent than anything she had imagined. Labor pains struck in the middle of the night, when there was no one in the rented room but her and the sound of rain tapping against the old window. Marin called Preston, not because she still had any hope left in him, but because some desperate instinct told her that the man should at least know his child was about to be born. The first call rang and died. The second, the third, and the fourth did the same. She texted him. She called again, over and over, and each unanswered ring became another brick laid into the wall of loneliness rising around her. He never picked up. Perhaps he had blocked her number, or perhaps he had simply watched her name appear on the screen, turned the phone face down, and returned to his dinner. Alone in the middle of the pain, Marin called the ambulance herself, and she entered the hospital on that rainy night with only her small suitcase and a heart that had learned not to expect anything from anyone anymore. The delivery lasted nearly 60 hours, a long and endless stretch filled with contractions, sudden spikes in blood pressure, and the harsh white lights of the emergency room. The nurses kept asking whether the baby's father was on his way, and each time, Marin only shook her head faintly, saving the little strength she had left for her own private battle. When the situation became dangerous, the doctors were forced to perform an emergency surgery. And then, at 3:12 in the morning, in the darkest and loneliest moment of her life, Marin heard her daughter's first cry, clear and strong, tearing through the night like a declaration that no matter what happened, life would still find a way to bloom. When they placed that tiny living being on her chest, a warm little body with closed eyes and curled fingers, all of Marin's pain, fear, and loneliness suddenly dissolved, giving way to a love so fierce that it made her break down in tears. She named her daughter Della, a gentle name for a child welcomed with every ounce of love a mother could give. In the quiet hospital room, with no flowers, no family, and not a single congratulatory call, the young mother held her daughter close and whispered to her that from now on, it would be just the two of them, and that she promised she would never let anyone make that little girl feel like a burden. Not even once. News of what had happened to Marin reached Royce Calloway in the way all news reached him, quietly, precisely, and more completely than people ever imagined. One of the former servants from the mansion, someone who still kept in touch with Marin, had accidentally mentioned her situation during a conversation, and only a few hours later, that information was lying on Royce's desk. He sat there for a long time, in the vast study with its dark paneled walls, listening as his trusted assistant recounted every detail, that the kind maid from years before had been married and then cast aside by a man from the Ashford family, that she had been thrown out of her home while pregnant, that she had gone through childbirth alone, while the baby's father did not even bother to answer the phone. Royce's face did not change at all throughout the story, but those who understood him knew that such stillness was more frightening than any outburst of rage. His gray eyes slowly darkened, like the surface of a lake before a storm. There was something in Marin's story that touched the deepest place Royce had always kept hidden from the world. Because long ago, from the days when he was still a boy, he had watched his own mother, a gentle woman who worked for others, be trampled and humiliated by powerful people without any way to fight back, and that wound had never truly healed inside him. Perhaps that was why, throughout his life, even after he had become a man the entire city feared, Royce still carried in his heart one rule that nothing could shake, that he would never tolerate the strong crushing the weak. And now, hearing what the Ashford family had done to the gentle maid who had once bandaged the kitchen boy's hand in his house, a cold and enduring fury began to kindle, the kind of fury that did not blaze violently, but burned low and steady, the most dangerous kind of fire because it never went out. Royce rose and walked to the tall window overlooking the city as its lights began to glow, his hands clasped behind his back. He stood there for a long while, and when he turned back, his voice was low and even. The voice his men had learned meant it was time to listen very carefully. He ordered his assistant to dig into every corner of the Ashford family, every transaction, every contract, every secret they had buried beneath their shining surface. He wanted to know what that pharmaceutical corporation had been hiding. He wanted to know how many lines Preston Ashford and his father had crossed to climb into their place. He said that people who believed they had the right to crush a defenseless woman often believed power and money made them untouchable, and that it was time to remind them how badly mistaken they were. And so, from the darkness, a machine began to move, silent and merciless. People whose faces no one knew began following financial trails. Doors that had seemed sealed shut began to open by a crack. Documents thought to have been destroyed began to appear again. Royce did not act impulsively. He had never been that kind of man. He patiently wove a net, thread by thread, waiting for the right moment to pull it tight. What made him different from ordinary powerful men was not that he was stronger than they were, but that he knew exactly when to strike and where to place the blow. Meanwhile, in a small rented room across the city, Marin was still holding her daughter and rocking her to sleep, completely unaware that the most powerful man she had ever served in silence was quietly clearing the way for a reversal of fate that even in her boldest dreams she had never dared to imagine. Imogen Frost came into Marin's life not with an ornate promise, but with a cup of cold coffee set down on the table in her cramped rented room. She was a public interest attorney, a small woman who had spent her entire career standing beside people who could not afford justice. When she heard Marin's story through an organization that supported single mothers, Imogen came to see her in person, and after sitting there listening, as the young mother recounted everything while one hand kept rocking baby Della's cradle, she closed her notebook, looked straight into Marin's eyes, and said she would take the case without charging a single cent. She said that in 20 years of practicing law, she had learned one thing, that powerful people often won not because they were right, but because they believed the vulnerable would be too afraid to fight back. And she added that she was far too tired of watching them win. In the days that followed, the two women sat together, piecing together each fragment of a picture Marin had not even realized she was holding. Imogen explained that a case was not won with tears or sympathy, but with evidence, and that what was remarkable was how Marin had unknowingly preserved so much valuable evidence. Throughout her time as Preston's wife, with the careful habits of someone who had once lived in deprivation and always had to protect herself, Marin had kept almost everything. The cold messages he had sent her, the emails about cutting off her health insurance, the history of unanswered calls on the night she went into labor, all of it remained intact on her old phone. And most important of all, she still had the entire hospital file, the documents clearly recording that she had been admitted alone, that the child's father had been contacted many times and never appeared, and how dangerous the birth had become. Imogen held those papers in her hands, and for the first time in many days, a faint smile crossed her stern face. She said that these things alone were enough to prove neglect, but to truly bring down an entire family, they would need more than that. And that was exactly when another force, one neither Marin nor Imogen had expected, quietly appeared. One afternoon, a neatly dressed man brought a thick leather briefcase to Imogen's office, leaving no name behind. saying only that these documents might be useful to her client. When Imogen opened the briefcase, she almost stopped breathing. Inside were internal documents from the Ashford Corporation that no ordinary lawyer could have accessed. Shadowy contracts, evidence showing that the family had quietly prepared legal procedures to strip the child of every right, and even traces of an intricate asset transfer plan designed to ensure that Marin and her daughter would never receive a single cent. Imogen understood that these documents had come from a very powerful force, someone capable of seeing through the walls the Ashford family had built. But she was wise enough not to ask too many questions. She simply fitted these new pieces into the picture already before her. When everything was arranged together, the evidence Marin had preserved herself and the evidence that had come from the shadows completed each other perfectly, forming a file so solid that no expensive team of lawyers could deny it. Marin looked at the neatly stacked documents on the table, and she felt something awaken inside her. Not gloating, not a hunger for revenge, but a quiet faith that this time, the truth finally had a place to stand. Imogen placed a hand on her shoulder and said that the road ahead would be no easy battle, that the Ashford family would use every trick they had to smear her name, but if Marin had enough courage to step into the courtroom and let the truth speak, then this time they had a chance to win. And Marin, holding her daughter close, gave a small nod. Back in the courtroom, after the opening procedures had passed, the Ashford family began launching the attack they had carefully prepared. Gerald Pine, the salt and pepper-haired lead attorney, rose with the bearing of a man who had never tasted defeat, and he began painting a story entirely different from the truth. In a deep, warm, persuasive voice, he told the court that his client, Preston Ashford, was the victim of a long, calculated scheme. He called Marin an ambitious woman, a maid who had cleverly taken advantage of Preston during a vulnerable period and trapped him into a marriage, with the sole purpose of climbing the social ladder she never could have reached on her own. He said the child was nothing more than a bargaining chip to secure herself a handsome payout from the Ashford family, and that this entire tearful drama was merely an elaborately staged performance meant to extract money. Those words were like daggers, not because they were true, but because they were spoken so smoothly and with such confidence that people almost wanted to believe them. Marin sat in silence, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, feeling every sentence and every word from Pine tighten around her throat. To be called greedy, a gold digger, someone exploiting her own child, was a cruelty worse than abandonment, because it deliberately twisted the very love she had for Della, turning the most sacred thing in her life into something filthy in the eyes of others. She felt the eyes of the people in the room turning toward her, searching, doubting, and in that moment, the old instinct of someone who had once been used to living in the shadows rose inside her again, urging her to lower her head, shrink into herself, and disappear. But the Ashford family did not stop at the courtroom. They were masters of manipulating public opinion, and they understood that a case like this was judged not only by a judge, but also by the court of the public. In the days before the hearing, articles began appearing in tabloid news outlets, with sensational headlines about a scheming maid trying to gut one of the city's most prestigious families. Photographs were carefully selected to make Marin look both pitiful and suspicious. Anonymous sources, which everyone understood had been arranged by the Ashfords themselves, spun all kinds of stories about her past, her motives, and the so-called true nature behind that gentle appearance. Sloane Whitaker, now seated in the gallery but still unable to hide her look of triumph, whispered something to a female reporter she knew, and only a few hours later, another smear piece spread across the internet. The pressure closed in on Marin from every direction, so heavy that on some nights she sat beside Della's cradle and wondered whether she had enough strength to see it through to the end. It was in that dark moment that Imogen Frost leaned toward her, placed her small hand on Marin's trembling arm, and whispered that this was exactly what they wanted her to do, that they were throwing all this mud not because they were strong, but because they were afraid of what she held in her hands. Imogen reminded her that every slanderous word the other side uttered was unintentionally digging their own hole deeper, because when the truth was finally exposed, the distance between today's lies and tomorrow's evidence would only make them look worse in the judge's eyes. Marin drew in a deep breath, lifted her head, and let her gaze move across Preston's coldly composed face, across the smug smiles of his legal team, across that entire world of power trying to grind her into dust. And she realized that she was no longer the maid from years ago who only knew how to bow her head. She was a mother. She had the truth, and she had come too far, endured too much, to collapse right at the threshold of justice. Stillness returned to her hazel eyes, but this time, It was no longer the stillness of someone who had surrendered. It was the stillness of someone preparing to strike back. When it was her turn, Imogen Frost rose without hurry, without theatrics, carrying only a thin folder as she stepped into the center of the room, with the composure of someone who knew exactly what she held. She began by asking the court's permission to present several documents. And then, piece by piece, the truth was placed on the table, one after another, without mercy. First came the medical records, official papers from the hospital showing that on the night her client went into labor in a life-threatening condition, her legal husband had been contacted a total of 17 times by phone and message, and not once did he respond. She read those numbers aloud slowly, giving each one time to sink into the air of the room. 17 calls over 60 hours while a woman struggled on the line between life and death, and absolute silence from the person who should have been there. Judge Brandt lowered her eyes to the file, her brows tightening faintly. But that was only the beginning. Imogen continued, this time with internal documents no one on the Ashford side had expected to have slipped out. She presented evidence to the court of a carefully drawn plan in which the Ashford family had prepared legal procedures in advance to strip baby Della of every inheritance right, while quietly shifting assets that should have belonged to the child into trusts under other people's names. She pointed out that Preston's public doubts about the baby's bloodline had not come from any basis whatsoever, but were a calculated move to create a legal excuse for denying responsibility, a scheme meant to ensure that the woman they had discarded and that innocent child would leave with nothing. Every document she offered had signatures, dates, and clear traces that could not be denied, and when they were fitted together, the entire room gradually understood that they were not witnessing the story of a greedy maid as the Ashford side had painted it, but the story of a powerful family that had coldly planned to crush a mother and her child. A wave of whispers spread through the courtroom. Several reporters bent over their notes as though afraid to miss a single word. Gerald Pine sprang to his feet with an objection, his voice having lost some of the smooth confidence it had carried at first. But his objections collided with the solidity of black and white evidence and grew weak. And then something no one had anticipated happened. Preston Ashford, who throughout the hearing had maintained his perfectly painted calm, began to crack. As he listened to his former wife's attorney expose each of his calculations before the eyes of the world, his face slowly reddened, his fingers clenching around the edge of the table. He leaned over and whispered something angry to his lawyer. Then, unable to restrain himself, he blurted out loudly that all of this was absurd, that he had no reason to take responsibility for decisions his entire family had made together, that everything would have gone smoothly if that woman had simply disappeared from sight. The moment those words left his mouth, the entire room fell silent, and Preston realized too late that he had just torn apart with his own hands the mask his expensive legal team had worked so hard to build for him. In one angry sentence, he had admitted that the plan was real, that his whole family was involved, and that what he wanted most was simply for Marin and her child to vanish. Judge Brandt snapped her head up, her sharp, cold eyes fixing directly on him, and she brought down her gavel with decisive force, demanding order. At the opposite table, Marin sat motionless, but inside her, something had suddenly become weightless. She felt no gloating, no triumph. She only looked quietly at the man who had once been her husband as he exposed his true nature beneath the light, and she understood that the truth, the thing that had been buried for so long beneath money and power, had finally found its own voice in this room. The hearing went into recess, and Preston stepped out into the hallway to breathe. His collar loosened, his face still marked by irritation after the disastrous slip of the tongue inside the courtroom. He needed a moment of quiet to steady himself, to find some way with his lawyers to salvage whatever could still be salvaged. But when he turned into the empty stretch of corridor leading toward the rear lobby, he stopped short, because standing there, leaning back against the marble wall with both hands tucked into the pockets of his dark coat, was a man he had never met, yet instantly sensed the danger coming from him like cold air. Royce Calloway did not speak at once. He only stood there, silently watching Preston with gray eyes that held no expression at all, and that gaze alone was enough to make the Ashford air feel as though someone had just pulled all the air from his chest. Preston tried to recover his usual arrogance, asking who the man was and what he wanted. Royce pushed away from the wall and took one slow step forward, and when he spoke, his voice was so low that Preston had to hold his breath to hear it clearly. He said there were names in this city that a wise man would never want mentioned in the same sentence as his own troubles, and that unfortunately for Preston, his name had just been placed beside one of them. Preston frowned, still trying to appear firm, and replied that he did not know who this man was. But he was an Ashford, and no one had the right to threaten him. A very faint smile passed across the corner of Royce's mouth, a smile with no warmth in it, like a crack in a slab of ice. He said Preston was wrong, that the Ashford name he was clinging to was nothing more than a thin coat of paint, and that Royce had spent the past week counting how much rot lay beneath it. Preston's face slowly changed, as Royce, still in that even voice, began naming details no outsider should have been able to know. He mentioned contracts the Ashford family thought they had buried, discrepancies in the pharmaceutical company's books, names, dates, and secrets that even Preston himself had only vaguely heard about. And with each sentence, Royce moved a little closer, until Preston realized he had been backing toward the wall without knowing it. The powerful man the entire city feared never raised his voice, never made a single brutal gesture, and yet every word he spoke was heavy as stone, driving Preston into a corner no expensive team of lawyers could pull him out of. Royce stopped directly in front of Preston, and he spoke his final sentence slowly and clearly. He said the woman Preston had cast aside, the woman he had tried to turn into a greedy schemer before the eyes of the world, had once been a kind human being in a house Royce called his own, and that for a man like Preston to dare lay his hands on someone like her was the greatest mistake in a life already full of mistakes. He said that from this moment on, every door the Ashford family had ever believed belonged to them would begin closing one after another, and that Preston would have the rest of his life to wonder why. Then, without waiting for Preston to answer, Royce stepped back, adjusted the collar of his coat, and turned away, leaving the Ashford heir rooted in the middle of the corridor, sweat beading on his forehead, for the first time in his life truly understanding what it felt like to realize he had provoked the wrong force. One his money and family name could never reach, and in the panic rising inside him, Preston still did not know that this was only the beginning. Preston's father, the aging patriarch of the Ashford family, was not the kind of man who accepted defeat quietly. When he heard that the hearing was slipping out of control, and that the family's secrets were beginning to come to light, he decided that if they could not win inside the courtroom, then they would have to frighten that woman badly enough to make her give up on her own. That afternoon, when the hearing ended and Marin left the courthouse to return to her daughter, who was being watched by a trusted friend in a safe place, 3 large men were already waiting in the deserted parking lot behind the building. They moved toward her, surrounding her in a half-circle. And the one in front, a broad-shouldered brute with a cold face, lowered his voice in threat and said she should be smart enough to withdraw the lawsuit, that there were forces someone like her should never touch, and that for her own safety and her child's, she would be better off disappearing from this city. Marin took one step back, her heart pounding hard, but she lifted her head and refused to let them see fear in her eyes. But before they could take another step forward, the entire parking lot suddenly flared bright beneath the headlights of several black cars rolling in, silent and swift as shadows. The car doors opened, and a group of men in dark suits stepped out, spreading into formation with such cold coordination that the 3 thugs immediately understood the situation had just turned against them. Walking among them, calm and unhurried as though he were strolling through his own garden, was Royce Calloway. He said nothing. He simply walked straight between Marin and the men, standing in front of her like a wall that could not be moved. The leader recognized Royce, and every trace of aggression vanished from his face in an instant, replaced by the pallor of a man who had just realized he had stepped into a lion's territory. Royce looked at the 3 men, his gray eyes sweeping over each one, then said in his familiar low voice that they had 3 seconds to decide whether they wanted to leave on their own 2 feet. There was no specific threat, no unnecessary gesture, and yet the weight in those words, together with the silent line of men standing behind him, was enough to make the 3 thugs, men used to bullying the weak, falter. Royce's men moved forward, and in one brief, tense moment, the 3 were completely overwhelmed, pushed back, stripped of every intention they had arrived with, without any real fight breaking out. One side's force crushed the other so completely that the confrontation ended almost before it had truly begun. The 3 men gradually backed toward their car, then turned and fled, leaving the parking lot to return to the stillness of the fading afternoon. Only when the danger had passed did Royce turn back to Marin. This was the first time the 2 of them had faced each other at such close range, since the days when she had been the quiet maid in his mansion. And in that moment, all the layers of power, strategy, and coldness around Royce seemed to loosen slightly. He asked whether she was all right, His voice softened from its usual edge. Marin looked at the man who had appeared twice now at the darkest moments of her life, once silently at the back of the courtroom, and now here, and she suddenly understood that this mysterious man was the silent benefactor behind everything. She quietly asked why he was doing all this for her, someone who was nothing more than a former maid. Royce was silent for a long while, then answered only that there were debts of grace in life a person could not leave unpaid, and that the kindness she had once sown in his house, though she might have forgotten it, he had always remembered. Then he opened the car door and invited her in, taking her safely back to the daughter who was waiting, leaving behind a city that was slowly beginning to understand that there were forces that did not show themselves off, but could not be moved by anything. The car rolled through the glowing streets, and in that soft quiet, Marin sat looking out through the window, the city lights sliding across her face in alternating streaks of brightness and shadow. Royce sat beside her, not urging, not questioning, simply allowing the silence to speak for itself. And then, as though something inside her had finally come unfastened after all those years of being locked tight, Marin began to speak, her voice light and distant, as if it had risen from somewhere deep within memory. She said she understood what it felt like to be trampled by the world, not only because of what had just happened to her, but because she had witnessed it since she was a child, through her own mother's life. She told him that her mother, too, had once been a hired woman, a gentle and patient soul who had given all her youth to serving in the homes of the wealthy. Marin still clearly remembered the sight of her mother coming home after long days, her thin shoulders sagging, her hands cracked from labor. But what hurt Marin most was not the physical exhaustion. It was the way her mother had been treated as though she were not a human being at all. She said her mother was often scolded for mistakes she had not made, treated as invisible even when she stood right in front of people, stripped of the most basic right of all, the right to be seen as a person with dignity. And yet her mother had never complained, never fought back. She only lowered her head and endured it, day after day, year after year, because she believed silence was the only way to protect her little girl. Marin said her mother had lived her whole life inside that silence, a silence she had mistaken for strength, when in truth, it was only a prison she had locked herself inside. Marin's voice trembled faintly when she spoke of her mother's final years. She said her mother had died when Marin was still far too young, quietly and without fuss, just as she had lived, carrying with her to the grave every humiliation she had never dared to put into words. Marin remembered that in those final days, her mother had held her hand and whispered that she had only one wish, that her daughter would not have to live a life with her head bowed as she had, that one day Marin would have enough courage to stand upright and reclaim the dignity her mother had never dared to demand for herself. Marin said that for all these years, she had lived exactly like her mother, quietly, enduringly, making herself invisible in order to survive in peace, until the day she stood in that courtroom and realized that if she kept silent, then not only she, but her daughter too, would be crushed by the very people who had once crushed her mother. She turned to look at Royce, her hazel eyes now shining with tears, and she said that everything she was doing was not only for herself, but also for her mother, for the promise she had never had the chance to speak before her mother was gone. She said that every time she stood up in that courtroom, she felt as though she were standing up on behalf of the mother who had never been given the chance to rise. Royce listened to all of it in silence, and across his face, usually as cold as stone, something seemed to crack faintly open, because Marin's story echoed the painful past he had buried for his entire life. In that moment, two people from worlds so far apart suddenly understood that they were connected by the same invisible thread, the same sorrow shaped like a mother. Royce did not say much. He only gently placed one hand over Marin's clenched one, an awkward and rare gesture from a man who had forgotten how to comfort another person, and he said softly that this time she would not have to stand up alone anymore. And outside, the city continued passing silently beyond the glass, bearing witness as two wounded souls finally found each other. On the day the ruling was announced, the courtroom was packed. News of what had been exposed in the earlier hearings had spread across the city, and now those who had once eagerly read the articles smearing Marin had come to witness the ending. Judge Eleanor Brandt entered with her familiar solemn bearing, took her seat, and allowed the entire room to settle into expectant silence before she began reading her decision. She said that in all her years on this bench, she had seen many cases in which power and money had tried to bend the scales of justice, but rarely had she seen such a blatant and calculated effort to strip a mother and an innocent child of their rights. Her voice was calm, But every word carried weight, and everyone in the room listened without daring to breathe too loudly. She declared that based on all the evidence presented, the court fully rejected the baseless accusations the Ashford side had built in an attempt to smear Attorney Frost's client. She affirmed that the medical records and the evidence of the asset seizure plan had made clear where the truth truly lay, and that the husband's public doubts about the child's bloodline had no foundation, serving only as an attempt to evade responsibility. Then she announced the final decision, that full custody of baby Della would be granted to her mother, that Preston Ashford would be required to provide support in accordance with the law, and that every scheme meant to strip the child of her lawful inheritance rights was declared void by the court. The wooden gavel came down with a decisive crack, closing a long and endless chapter of injustice. In the courtroom, a wave of commotion broke loose. A few people let out soft cries of relief, and several reporters hurried outside to file the news in time. But amid all those sounds, Marin only sat quietly. She did not cheer. She did not break down sobbing. She did not turn to look at Preston with triumph in her eyes. She only closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, she lowered her gaze to her hands resting on the table. The calloused hands that had once scrubbed so many floors, that had once trembled through the lonely night of labor, and that now, at last, were being held up by the weight of justice. Her joy did not burst outward. It seeped silently inward, deep and lasting, like rain sinking into soil that had been dry for far too long. Because for someone who had passed through so much loss, true victory was not applause, but the peace that had finally found its way home. At the other table, the Ashford family sat frozen. Preston kept his head lowered, no longer daring to look up at anyone, because now, before the eyes of the entire city, he was no longer the glamorous heir, but the man who had coldly abandoned his wife and child and been exposed by his own words. The evidence revealed in the courtroom quickly spread beyond it, and the reputation of the Ashford Pharmaceutical Corporation, something the family had painstakingly built over many generations, began cracking apart piece by piece. Business partners quietly withdrew. Doors that had always stood wide open now began closing one after another, exactly as a certain man had once said in an empty hallway. Gerald Pine gathered his papers with the face of a man who had just lost a battle, while Sloane Whitaker had not appeared in the gallery for several hearings. When Marin stepped out of the courthouse, the afternoon sunlight poured over the stone steps, strangely warm. Imogen walked beside her and gently squeezed her hand, saying nothing, because between two women who had passed through this battle together, every word had become unnecessary. And at the foot of the steps, leaning beside a dark-colored car, Royce Calloway waited in silence. He did not approach. He did not make a show of himself. He only gave her a slight nod from a distance, like a quiet confirmation that she had done it, that she had stood upright, just as she had promised the mother from long ago. Marin held her daughter tightly against her chest, drew in a deep breath of the air of freedom, and for the first time in many years, she walked forward without feeling that she had to bow her head before anyone. More than 1 year had passed since the day of the ruling, and Marin's life had turned in a direction she herself had never dared to dream of. The support and compensation ordered by the court had given her a stability she had never known, but instead of using it to live an easy life for herself, Marin chose to do something else. She still remembered with perfect clarity the loneliness of those days when she had been cast aside, the feeling that there was no door to knock on, no hand to hold, and she remembered, too, the quiet life of her mother and so many others like her, poor workers who had spent their whole lives serving in other people's homes without ever being seen as human beings with dignity. And so, with Royce's silent support behind her, Marin opened a shelter, a shared home for maids, domestic workers, and laborers who had been trampled by employers, cheated out of wages, treated unjustly, and left with nowhere to turn. The place was set inside an old building renovated in a peaceful neighborhood, and Marin gave it a simple name that carried the meaning of refuge. There, struggling workers could find free legal help, learn new skills to seek better work, and have a safe place to stay when they had reached the end of the road. Imogen Frost became the shelter's chief legal advisor, giving her free afternoons to listen to and defend the people the law had once seemed to forget. Marin ran everything herself, and those who came there quickly realized that the woman leading the place did not look down at them from above, but met them eye to eye, because she had once stood exactly where they were standing, had once tasted the very same humiliation they were tasting. Perhaps that was what made her shelter special, a place that did not hand out pity, but gave back dignity. And amid all of that busyness, little Della grew like a ray of sunshine. She had now begun taking her first toddling steps, her plump cheeks always rosy, and her clear laughter rang through the halls of the shelter, making even the most exhausted people laugh along with her. She became everyone's shared joy there, passed lovingly from the arms of one woman to another, cherished and protected, growing up inside a wide embrace of affection, never knowing that she had once almost been rejected. Marin often watched her daughter play in the sunlit courtyard, chasing butterflies, clapping with delight at a flower that had just opened. And in those moments, her heart filled with a simple happiness she had not dared believe she would ever have. Della did not grow up lacking love, and that made Marin prouder than anything else. Royce was still there, quiet as he had always been. He never displayed his role, never demanded gratitude, but behind the good fortune the shelter found, behind the doors that suddenly opened at exactly the right time, people could sense his unseen hand. Sometimes he stopped by in the late afternoons, standing at a distance as he watched Della play with a tenderness in his eyes that those who feared him out in the city would surely never believe was real. Between him and Marin, there were no flowery words, no eager gestures, only a quiet understanding that grew deeper with the years, an affection rooted in two souls carrying similar wounds and finding in each other a place of peace. After all the storms, life had finally returned to that kind woman something worthy of all she had given away. One late autumn night, as the first cold rain of the season tapped steadily on the roof of the shelter, a weak knock sounded at the door. Marin went to open it, and she stopped short when she recognized the man standing beneath the porch roof, soaked through and trembling in the yellowish light. It was Preston, but this was no longer the glittering heir from years before. After everything had come apart, the Ashford family's pharmaceutical empire had collapsed beneath the weight of its scandals, and his own father, the man who had once called him back to inherit, had cast him aside once again when he no longer had any value to use. The woman in the white silk dress from long ago had also left a long time ago, taking with her all the affection she had once pretended to show. Now Preston stood there, worn down, his clothes rumpled, his once arrogant face marked by the lines of a man who had lost everything. He looked at Marin with reddened eyes, and then he began to speak, his voice choked. He said he had been wrong, that now, after losing everything, he finally understood what truly mattered. He brought up their earliest days together, the morning she had wiped away the spilled coffee and told him everyone was clumsy sometimes, all the tiny memories he had thought he had forgotten. He said he still remembered all of it, that she was the only person who had ever treated him like a real human being, and that now he only wished to begin again, to be a father to Della, to make amends for all his mistakes. Then he slowly sank to his knees on the rain-wet steps, lifting his head to look at her, rainwater and tears mingling on his face, and he begged her to give him one final chance. For a moment, only a moment, something inside Marin softened slightly, because she was a kind person, and her heart had never truly known how to harden itself against another person's pain, even when that pain belonged to someone who had once treated her cruelly. She looked at the man kneeling before her, looked at his misery, and in that instant, her old compassion almost rose again. But then she thought of the rainy night years ago, when she had called him 17 times in the middle of labor and not once had he answered. She thought of his cold face in the courtroom when he denied his own child. She thought of the mother who had lived and died in silence because she had never dared to stand up, and she understood that her kindness was not a doorway anyone could simply walk through, especially not someone who had already broken it down once. She looked straight into his eyes, and when she spoke, there was no anger in her voice, no tears, only a steady calm as firm as the ground beneath her feet. She said she forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because she did not want to carry resentment as baggage for the rest of her life. But she made it clear that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, and it certainly did not mean returning. She reminded him that on the day he stood in the courtroom and declared he had nothing to do with the child, he had chosen his own place in that child's life, and she would respect the choice he had made. Just then, the sound of small footsteps came from behind her, and little Della rushed out, wrapped her arms around her mother's leg, and lifted her clear eyes toward the strange man kneeling out on the rainy porch with the pure curiosity of a child, then buried her head in her mother's skirt, not recognizing him at all. That moment spoke everything in silence, because to the little girl, the man was only a stranger, and that was the highest price Preston had to pay, a price no court had pronounced, yet heavier than any sentence. Marin gently lifted her daughter into her arms, stepped back inside, and closed the door, not with a slam, not with bitterness, but softly, as one closes a book whose final page has already been read. 2 years passed, and one clear spring morning returned to the courtyard of the shelter. Little Della was now a clever, small girl, running everywhere with her lightly curled brown hair flying in the sun, her bright eyes shining exactly like her mother's. She was chasing soap bubbles that shimmered as they floated across the yard, laughing merrily every time her little hand managed to touch one, and that laughter rang out so clearly that the whole garden seemed to brighten with it. Marin stood leaning beside the doorway, quietly watching her daughter, and a deep peace rose inside her, one no words could ever fully describe. The child who had once been rejected in a room full of strangers was now growing up radiant and filled with love, carrying not a single scar from the past. Sometimes, in quiet moments like that, Marin still remembered the cold sentence that man had spoken in the courtroom years ago, that he had nothing to do with that child. But now, as she watched Della laughing in the sunlight, she only smiled faintly, because she had come to understand something she could not see back then. Della had never been a problem, never a burden or a bargaining chip the way others had once tried to make her. She was living proof that love could survive even the cruelest betrayal, that a person's dignity was never decided by whether they were rich or poor, noble or lowly, but by how they chose to live and how they chose to love. That man had denied her, but in that denial, he had lost the most precious thing, while Marin had kept everything. Royce remained quietly present in the lives of mother and daughter, without noise, without display, like a sturdy roof that was always there whenever it was needed. Between him and Marin, there were no flowery vows, only a deep respect and understanding that grew stronger with the years, a lasting affection built from kindness and compassion between two people who had passed through similar pain. She had learned that true strength did not lie in shouting or revenge, but in the calm courage to stand upright and live a kind life despite everything. And she had also learned that the seeds of love we sow in silence, even when they seem forgotten for many years, will one day take root and return to shelter us at the very moment we need them most. Marin's story, from a maid who had been trampled down to a woman who rewrote her own life, is a gentle reminder that no one, no matter how small they may seem in the eyes of the world, is ever undeserving of respect and love. If Marin's story has touched your heart in some way, please leave a like and share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so that every day we can listen together to more meaningful stories that move the heart. How do you feel about Marin's journey? And if you were her, would you have had the courage to stand upright as she did? Please leave a few lines in the comments so we can hear the honest emotions from deep within.